everyone, I'm Troy Dodds and welcome to the On The Record podcast presented by The Western Weekender. On this podcast, I'm joined by special guests who all have such great stories to tell about Penrith and the role they've played in our city. They are Penrith stories told by Penrith people. Today, my special guest is Peter Lang. Peter has lived in Penrith for almost half a century and has worked with some of the region's biggest brands. From Panthers to Penrith City Council and even us here at the Western Weekender, Peter's fingerprints are all over some of Penrith's largest employers. Peter has an intriguing story to tell and I hope you enjoy our chat. Peter, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dodsy, and thanks for revealing how old I am, you bugger.
Well, talking of that, tell us, as we always ask at the start of the podcast, where were you born and where did you grow up?
Well, believe it or not, I was born in Nottingham in England, in the good old UK, to Polish parents who were living there at the time. My sister was born 4.5 years before me. We just kept getting ill all the time, sick, colds, flu, asthma, because of mainly the cold and damp conditions over there. So Mum and Dad decided to pack up, leave all their family and come to Australia in about, I think it was about 1972, late 1972. And it wasn't long before we arrived in Penrith. So we decided to move to Penrith because the housing back in 1973 was a lot more affordable. And Mum and Dad thought this was a good place to start, like a small developing little community. Didn't have much back in 1973, but pretty much it's been home since then for all of us.
And of course you went to school at both Kingswood Public and Kingswood High School?
Yeah, look, I cannot think of anywhere where I've received any sort of teaching or training or working that hasn't been in Penrith. Maybe a bit of work experience in the city once or twice, but I went to Kingswood High School, public school, should I say, first up. Followed that up with Kingswood High School in 82, and then in 89 I went to the University of Western Sydney. So pretty much all of my education was in the local area and didn't have to go very far to get it as well.
Now, of course, you're finishing high school, I guess, in the late 80s. Would that be about right?
Yeah, mid 80s. Oh, my goodness, I feel even older. Oh, hang on. No, I suppose you're right. 87.
All
Finished high school in 87.
What's Penrith?
So that's late.
What's Penrith like in that late 80s, early 90s kind of period?
Very small. I mean, there was only one lane each way down Mulgoa Road, and I think there was only one or maybe possibly two lanes on the northern road. Glenmore Park wasn't around. South Penrith, where I grew up with my parents, it was just starting up. Southlands down the road was about to be built. So I mean, there's all those things that started to come up around in the 80s, and you'd notice driving up and down Mulgoa Road, more and more businesses starting to open on either side. And then before you knew it, the roadworks started to come, and I just remember, just from getting here in 73, I thought in 1988, 89 that I was in a metropolis because of the big changes, even during that small time. But of course, you look back now and it's chalk and cheese, the last 25 years or so.
Now, your media career begins in 1991, but was media something that you were always interested in following, or did that come about by accident?
No, look, I loved the media. I used to love pretend that I was on radio, and I'd grab my little tape recorder with those little cassettes in there, and I'd record, programs with friends and music. And when I was at school, I used to pretend that I was a newsreader. And so I always had a very huge, massive interest in media. Obviously not what it is today, because there was no internet, there was no Facebook, no social media, nothing. But even just the TV, radio, I think I was more drawn to radio than anything else, though, because I do have a head for radio, not for TV, and I think I realised that pretty early on in life.
The Weekender launches in 1991 here in Penrith, and you become involved in that same year, doing some work experience. So tell us about the Weekender in those very early days.
Well, it just started up against the Star and the Penrith Press, which were well established by that stage. And I remember thinking, well, I'm not going to get much luck there. And I think I even actually sent some resumes to them when I was in my last year at uni, which was 91. Never really heard back from them. They offered to do, a few days here and there of work experience. But the Weekender just sort of like opened their arms to me and sort of said, yeah, we want to, we're happy to have you here doing a lot of things. You can write stories, you can edit things, you can, cut things down, you can do all those sort of things. And I thought, well, that's far more than I'll ever get at one of the two majors. So basically, I remember going into the original location. Greg Evans was starting it all up, and he ran it through the offices where he was still selling his Apple computers. So there was like, One side there was the Apple computers, and the other side was the Weekender staff. It was small, and we were basically doing things like, oh, how long ago it was. We would be cut and pasting stories onto a page, which would then be
literally cutting and pasting.
literally and figuratively cutting and pasting stories and ads onto a page, which would then be sent through to Rural Press or whoever it was back then that was doing it. They'd obviously take a photo of it, take the shot, and off they went. So that sort of technology that went on for years. But I just remember sitting there thinking, I've hit the big time here. I was working for free, and
which by the way is where the term cut and paste comes from the traditional printing methods. Now, where was this office? Where was this one?
This one was where the guitar shop used to be, in just across the road from the RSL.
Okay,
that was the original office. So I can't. What street's that in? We're looking at the RSL. So I've only lived here.
Yeah,
for
that's
50 years
Castlereagh Street. So
that's right.
That's
yeah,
first office.
So that's where it was originally. It moved about a little bit here and there. So over the next couple of years, they moved. But I don't want to get ahead of myself, so I better let you ask a few questions.
Yeah, well, 1992. Lyndall Edwards, of course, is the inaugural editor of the Weekender for those first couple of years, and the Weekender has only had 3 editors in its history. She offers you a gig in late 1992. First paid gig as a journalist, would that be right?
Yes, yeah, it certainly was. I think it was for about $10 an hour, and I think it was something like 15 to 20 hours a week. I'd finished uni, obviously the year before, and just grabbed it with both hands, because let's just say I wasn't in high demand. You knock on a lot of doors, and all they want is experience. And of course, first year out of uni, I didn't have much. So it was just, I went to uni with Lyndall, and that's how she knew me, and that's how the first position that I ever got came up. And I was just tickled pink. And I actually couldn't believe it also, because they wanted me to write the rugby league. And I know we'll probably get into this later, but was and still am a huge Panthers fan. So to get the opportunity to do that was just amazing. But, you also did your advertorials and things like that. At that stage, I just didn't care. I just wanted to get in there and start writing, basically.
Now, I know that there's talking of rugby league, there's a story in 1993, I think it is, where you're interviewing Gus Gould. Bit of an interesting situation there for you.
Yeah. So we were playing a trial there against Parramatta in 1993, and I got a lift of one of the assistant coaches for, I think it was under 21s, they were calling it back then. And I got in there and I watched the match. We actually won it. I remember we were down 12-0. Paul Dunn was playing for Parramatta at the time, and we came on with a virtually reserve grade team. But in the end, they won it. And I got to go into the sheds after the match, and I'm standing there, and I said to Phil Gould, do you mind having a quick chat with me? And he said, no worries whatsoever. So I did about 15-minute chat about the year ahead, the game, everything. I was so proud of myself. I thought, I'm just going to play this to everyone and say, look, I interviewed Phil Gould. And I got back in the car to check to make sure it was all good. Nothing. The batteries had fallen out the back of the tape machine. So not only did I not have Phil Gould on tape, which I was wanting to show off to everybody, I then had to sit there and feverishly in the car write everything that I remembered him saying, just to make sure that, when I wrote the story up, I accurately quoted him.
Pete, so every journo has been there, Pete, in one way or another.
So that was my first experience interviewing a coach. Let me tell you this much, though, Dodsy, I never, ever ran out of batteries or another interview ever again. I got every single one after that.
1993, there's a change at the Weekender. Bernard Bertusa becomes the editor. He becomes the editor then and stays for the next 15 or 16 years. What was working with Bernard like in those days? We both worked under Bernard's editorship.
Yeah, well, Bernard back then had come from the bank, and I think originally, from memory, he was doing some finance work for Greg. This is just going back a long time, so I apologise if I get it wrong. The next thing we know that he's taken over and he's the new editor. And I remember he was very fair. He was, always polite and nice to me, and he was demanding. I'll give him that. Like when he wanted something, he had to do it. But if you did it and you did it well, then you never had an issue with him. But I remember more than that, thinking to myself, there was always this dark cloud hanging over the Weekender at the time. The advertising, will we get enough? Will it keep going? All those sort of things were still swirling around back back then a little bit because the Star and the Press were going strong at that stage, and that's why the next part of my career happened, which I ended up leaving the Weekender at the end of '93. I didn't think it was secure enough. I was worried that they closed down, so I went and got a job out at Rural Press, which is Hawkesbury Gazette. Back in '94. And I remember leaving with a lot of regret and a lot of sadness. I remember saying to Greg Evans at the time, I said, oh, look, I'm really sorry. There's an opportunity there for me and it's full time because I was only working part time. And I just felt sad. And I remember Bernard shaking his head when I left and he just said something on the lines of, you're making a mistake. And I just said, well, I hope not. And I walked out and I felt really bad. So then I lasted about 3 months at the Hawkesbury Gazette. Hated it. More so because that wasn't the place where my heart was in Hawkesbury. And doing stories about people in the area and, the constant running around and I felt like a stranger there and I just didn't like it. It wasn't Penrith. It wasn't my home. I wrote to the best of my ability, but I didn't care. And so in the end, I left without another job to go to at that stage.
But of course, you returned to the Western Weekender, and that's where Lang On League is born. Now, we still run Lang On League today in the Western Weekender. But tell us how that was born, and also how you ended up back here, because Bernard shaking that head. I guess he was proven right.
Yeah, he was. I remember I didn't even tell him that I was back for about 6 weeks. I think it was a couple of months I remember it being. And then I gave him a call and just said to him, look, if anything pops up, I'm back. And I remember him saying something like, oh, I told you you'd be back. But he goes, look, I've got nothing for you at the moment. And he said, if anything pops up, I'll let you know. About a week or two later, it wasn't any more than that, he gives me a call and says, let's go and have a chat. And so, without going on too long, we had a chat. He brought me back into the fold and welcomed me back in again. And I remember saying to him about the league, because at the time he was writing a bit of it himself. And I said to him, hey, I've got one for you. What about Lang On League? And I laughed because at the time there was a lot of journos getting their faces and pictures in the paper. And he said, not in my lifetime. And that was it. And I just never mentioned it. Well, when the footy season began back up again, a few months later, he said, I'm giving you Lang On League and we'll get a photo. So make sure you dress up that ugly mug of yours and look good in it. So there was about 400 pictures taken. We found one that didn't make me look too hideous and scare the children. And that's how it was born back in, 93, 94, late 93, 94 is when it sort of started.
Now, I'm interested in the mid-90s, you leave the Weekender and you worked for Panthers magazine. Now, if you weren't around Penrith during this sort of late 90s, early 2000s, like Panthers magazine during the 90s was a massive magazine. I've still got a few of them sitting in my drawer here at the Weekender offices, and it was about 100 pages. It was a massive magazine. It was not just Panthers focused. It was had its own advertising team selling ads, and it had everything going on in Penrith, some news and whatnot. But obviously, very very slated back towards Panthers. But tell us about that experience and what working there was like.
So Jackie Tyers at the time was the editor of the magazine. I probably should have added that while I was working at the Weekender, I also wrote the rugby league for the magazine for a couple of years as well, which was about 4 or 5 stories a month, which Bernard was happy with and everyone was fine with it. And through that, I got a call from Jackie saying, "Look, I've just going to maternity leave. How would you like to take over for a year? I'll do X and you can do all the stories and everything." And basically I went and saw Bernard, and then he basically said, yeah, that's a good opportunity. Go ahead and do it. And I did. So basically I went to Panthers, and from about 96 till, only about a year and a half later, things changed again in 97. But I'll let you sort of, flesh that one out. But you're right, the Panthers magazine back then was about 120 odd pages, 100 minimum in the mid sort of 90s. It was really in its heyday. So that was also a big experience to try and put that together as well every month.
And of course, you stay working at Panthers, as you mentioned, a bit of a changed role. Now, anyone who's worked with Panthers over the years in the media would know the name Rob Weaver. I think Rob's retired now. He was the Panthers media manager for a long period of time. I always remember there was always a bit of fear in calling Rob the traditional like Rob Weaver Panthers as he
Yeah, that voice.
answered the phone. Now you started working for him in the media team there at Panthers. This is during an interesting period because rugby league had already, I guess, taken giant steps to being professional, but the Super League war obviously not only tears the game apart, but changes the game completely as far as what's expected from media and commercial and professionalism as well, and you're in the midst of all of that.
Yeah, look, the one thing I remember about all that was that there was a period of time there where it really did look like we would become the Parramatta Panthers. And I know that there's differing views from various staff that worked there at the time about whether that's a fact or not. But I've said this story before in print and also in other forums. And all I remember was I was going to I think I was talking to the CEO of Panthers at the time, and I think it might have been Mark Levy. And I said to him, look, like, what do I do? I'm hearing rumours of Penrith and Panthers joining up together. Where does that leave me? And he said, I'd start looking for another job. And that's when I went, oh my goodness, this is going to happen. We're going to join up and we're going to become the Parramatta Panthers. Shortly after that noise got a bit louder, there was a meeting held which had all the members, and Ron Mulock came along to talk at it. And it was my job to run around with the microphone to anyone who got a question, so I'd run around and do it. Now, to this day, I still believe that was the turnaround as to why we didn't become the Parramatta Panthers and decided to go it alone. He spoke so powerfully, so well, so articulated. He had all the facts, he had all the figures, he gave everything. I'll never forget it. And when that meeting finished that day, I just knew that we were going to stand alone, no matter what. Now, people will, argue against that, but that's my recollection and memory of it, and it's a very strong one.
Now, of course, what's working for Rob and the Panthers media team like at the time? Because media, this is internet's arrived, but it's certainly not the main media source that it is today. So, what was dealing with journos and handling all that sort of stuff like at the time?
Yeah, well, as you just said, I remember we were one of the first clubs that actually had a forum, and
Panthers Interactive.
Yeah, that's right. And I just remember the website, and Rob was, and deservedly so, proud of himself because he managed to put things up, every few days, and it was just like this beast that continued to grow and grow. Now, I do remember that Super League came along in '97, as we all know. And they had a ton of money. So they threw a lot of money at us there at Panthers as well. So we put out like glossy publications. We put out 20-page lift outs. And even though we didn't have what we have now with social media, there was still more work than Rob could handle on his own. So he, for want of a better word, seconded me to become his full-time assistant back then. And that gave me the opportunity to write for the Super League magazine and do interviews, do things on the screen, do all sorts of different things through that year, because Super League just had this money that they were just throwing out to try and win the public over. So I do remember the big opening day. We had Belinda Carlisle there. Singing at the, I think the first game we played was against Perth, or I think they were called the Perth Reds. They went to Western Reds back then. Yeah. And basically, it was just a feeling of grandeur, and you just knew that all bases were covered because there was plenty of money to cover it.
Absolutely. And of course, you go back to the NRL forms in 1998. You stay around, of course, as at Panthers, but then you become the editor of Panthers magazine. So that must have been a big moment for you, because Panthers magazine at this point is still going strong, still got the backing of the club, and you're put in charge.
Yeah, well, basically what happened was that with us going back to the ARL, a lot of the funding was obviously reduced. Things were starting to get back to what they were, and there were times where we all worried how long this assistant position would last for. I actually still got to do it for a couple of more years, 98, 99. That was when I got to travel with the team. We got to go to Auckland, Adelaide, Townsville, all these sort of places. I'll always remember those couple of years. But in 99, they I was a bit worried again, how long that would last. I just bought a property, a house, and the safer bet when they approached me was to do the Panthers magazine, to be the editor of Panthers magazine. I could still write the football. I could still help out on game day because they're the things I loved and I didn't want to let go of. And they gave me permission to do all that. And then, yep, yours truly started to do the editor of Panthers magazine back then, 99, sort of till about 2002. It was an interesting 3 years. I'll tell you that much, Doddsy.
Yeah, well,
Really
of course,
interesting.
this is around the time there's a lot of drama at the club. We know that Roy Simmons gets sacked as coach, and you and Roger Cowan had a bit of an issue. Now, you weren't the first person to have an issue with, with Roger Cowan, let me assure you of that. But I know that there was a bit of a drama around Royce and Royce's sacking and Panthers magazine at the time.
Yeah, so I wrote a cover story and a 2-page story on the inside about how Royce was, what he's going to do in 2002. Finishing this season, I think we won the Spoon that year in 2001, and there was no filtering then. I mean, I just made the decisions and said, yeah, let's do it. We did it all. Next thing I know, Roger wants to have a chat to me, so I go into his office and he just says to me, look, you should have run that by someone, because that might not be the case, about Royce. And at that stage, he was still, the coach. But within about a week of that, that's when, he was let go. And of course, they then hired John Lang. And it sort of made them look a bit silly. Well, I made them look silly, I suppose, because a month earlier, I'm saying he's going to be around for 2022, not 2022, 2002, explaining in detail what his plans were, and next minute he's gone. So, that was a bit of embarrassing for me, and another lesson learned, I suppose, in the world of publishing, that you can't take it back. Now, unlike now.
With John Lang comes Shane Richardson, of course, as the new man in charge of the footy operations at Panthers. Now, I would argue, just from my dealings with them, that two very separate identities there in terms of how they operate. How was working with Shane Richardson?
The first meeting I had with him was outstanding. I thought, what a lovely bloke. He was chirpy, he was cheerful, he just got his feet under the desk. Of course, John Lang came along as well, support staff, everything. I thought, this is going to be great. This is going to be great dealing with him, because I must admit, Mark Levy was great to deal with all those years that he was there as well. And so I thought, this is just going to be wonderful. It's just one nice CEO to another. Well, that didn't last long. I had to write we're in the magazines, but previews we had to write from the coach's perspective, a note from the CEO. And of course, as I don't know if it still happens, but back then you'd interview them and he'd write it for them and then they'd approve it and off it went. So I did the interview. It was fine. He was happy. I sent him a draft of it. Well, did I cop it? Get a phone call. Peter, this is absolute rubbish. What do you mean? I've never been so terribly misquoted and in my whole life, and I've been around for a long time. He said, this is absolute garbage. And he went off for about, at least a minute, about how he didn't really say that. He didn't really mean that. And I said to him, well, look, feel free to, run your eye over it and change whatever you like. Oh, I will. Bang. And he hung up on me. So that was my introduction, or second introduction to him. So after that, needless to say, we were all walking on eggshells. Rob Weaver got yelled at. The photographer who took the pictures back then, he got yelled at. And it was just a feeling of whenever you went sort of near him or around him, you didn't know whether you'd get Jekyll or Hyde. And I just remember being always frightened around him at the time. So. Yeah, it wasn't a fun time when with dealing with him anyway. For me anyway. I don't know about everybody else, but for me anyway, that wasn't the most pleasant experience.
Now, Pete, I'm going to bring this up too, because this happens around this time. There has been over the years a few Western Weekender romances that have emerged. Not all of them have worked out all that well. I know that in that period as well, your first marriage ends. So I'm guessing you're dealing with some tough personal times as well as those issues at work with the likes of Shane.
Yeah, so basically, yeah, what happened is, God love him, Bernard actually gave my first wife the opportunity to work there. He created a position for her back in, I think it was 99, end of 99, 2000, to start as a journalist there. To which I'll always, be grateful. Though looking in hindsight, it would have been better had he not done it. But back then, it seemed like the right thing to do. Yeah. So basically, yeah, what happened then was, again, I was still married at the time, but the magazine started to just peter off a little bit. Advertising was getting harder to get. The pages were shrinking. We were going from 100 pages, we were down to like 48, sometimes even 32. So it was time again to look for another position, because, like, at that stage, I was still married, and at 2002, still things were going okay, and I thought I've got to get some security. So then I went for a job at Penrith City Council as a marketing tourism officer,
Yep.
and basically left Panthers at 2002, but again got to stay on for the next 10 years and just help out on game day as the assistant to Rob Weaver
Mm.
first, and then Andrew Farrell later. But that's how I sort of why I took the job at Penrith City Council. Same reason why I guess I left the Weekender all those years prior, just for a bit more job security. And then basically, yeah, 2003 it comes, and the marriage ends, and my wife back then leaves, obviously the Weekender, and basically I'm at council.
Yeah, so a pretty significant change
Oh
in your
yeah,
life around
yeah.
that period. Yeah. Now, council has been now part of your life then for something like 20 years. In fact, it'll be 20 years this year. That original job is in marketing and tourism. This is around a time that council is very, very strong in this. They had the centre there in the car park at Panthers
Yep.
and all of that. So it was an interesting time too, because the Olympics had just happened a couple of years earlier. Penrith had very much on the map around that time.
Yeah, a lot was growing there. That was when we even had good old Krispy Kreme, and we were the only, I think, city back then that had it. So we would get people travelling, up to an hour, even longer, to stand in a long queue to get it. And I just remember a lot of money being poured into resources to promote Penrith as a tourism place, as a place to come along, go on the Nepean Bell. The Olympics had given us enormous exposure, and they wanted to piggyback onto that as well by selling other sites at Penrith at the time. And I think that's probably when I remember, the Mulgoa Road expanding. I remember, just more trees and more everything around the area just improved. Of course, we had Glenmore Park that was filling out at the time. The plaza was going through renovations. So I just remember myself thinking, we are now becoming a small city, not just a little country town, and everyone knew it. And I think the Olympics played a really huge role in that happening. It just brought in all that infrastructure, the Whitewater Stadium, the Olympic, the Regatta Centre, all those things. Then post Olympics were attractions that we could sell to people, encourage them to come down. The Nepean River was also one of the big things that we promoted at the time, and so yeah, there was plenty to do, and it just kept each year that I was there in that role, more and more things were being done, and more, money was being put into promoting Penrith as a tourism destination.
How different for you was it going from working for Panthers to council? Because it can be a tough transition for people to go to that kind of government world that is just a bit different in terms of how it operates.
Yeah, and I remember I wasn't in charge for a start, whereas at Panthers I was pretty much running the show. So it was a new job at the same time. I'd done a bit of marketing here and there, but never full time. So the good thing was I had a very, very, very good supervisor, Paul Page, who unfortunately passed away just over a year ago, sadly. So that's something that I remained friends with him even after he left Penrith City Council. I just remember making a lot of friends, and still even to this day, you keep in touch with people that you meet along the way and in your work. They become like your family, because you see them 7 or 8 hours a day. So it's just natural that they become really important in your life. So pretty much have enjoyed, without sounding like I'm doing a big commercial, I've enjoyed my 20 years at Panthers, at Penrith City Council. And look, you get a lot of freedom as well, depending on which department I guess you work for. And it's been a big part of my life. I remember saying to people, I started there. Now 20 years later, I've got a different wife, two kids, different house, everything. So your life moves on, and you just hope that you can find a place like I have with council, that you can move along with it.
Now,
Not that every year's been wonderful, but most have.
importantly, rugby league still played a big part of your life during those early 2000s when you went to council, because you sort of transitioned back into the weekender as well around that time.
Yeah, well, I kept writing the football for Weekender for many years, even after I'd left. Even when my ex-wife was there, I still wrote football for them then, and continue to do so for many years after. I think it was a young bloke called Troy Dodds who might have come along and taken my gig at the Weekender, I think, because there was a time I can't remember the exact details, but there was a time then where obviously I stopped writing stories for the rugby league stories for the Weekender, and I think that's when you came along. I'm sure that's what it was.
Potentially around that that general
around that
time.
period.
But of course, then things go a bit awry for the Weekender, and we've talked about that in previous podcasts. And I end up at Kick FM, and as a result, so do you, because we talked for a couple of years about the footy, and also at Vintage FM. I know we had the mixed grill, for a while there on a Sunday night, which is the thing I remember greatly about the mixed grill is that my co-host, or our co-host Michael Todd, and I would have a big afternoon, normally watching a couple of games of footy with a few beverages, and we'd rock up to do the show, and you'd rock up with all your notes, very serious, and it was a good time.
Oh, look, all I can say is working with you guys was a barrel of fun. Working with you was awesome. I think we had a connection from the very first time we spoke. And I actually remember the first time you interviewed me. I was actually at my second and current wife, Sonia's place at the time, which was with the parents, and still we hadn't got married, so I'd visit her. And I remember doing the interviews from her bedroom. She'd leave, and you and I'd be talking about the reserve grade and this and that, and yeah, you and I bonded as well. And I'd have to say that the Kick FM days and then even the Vintage days with you were a lot of fun. Just to talk about football and various things was just awesome. So I really do miss those days, to be honest with you. I wish we could bring it back. We should bring it back as a podcast, you and I, and even Nathan, my nephew, who's now at the Weekender as well, and get it going again. And nothing better than talking footy with your mates and actually having people listen to it, which is even better.
Absolutely. Now you mentioned Sonia there, your current wife, of course. Tell us about how you met Sonia.
Yeah, so Sonia and I met, believe it or not, I think it was through RSVP, a website.
Yes.
So success, people go on about, Tinder wasn't around back then. So it was pretty much straightforward, and she saw a picture and liked that I liked John Farnham, I think it was, and one of her friends said, yeah, give this goose a go. And pretty much we met in end of 2006. She's definitely the love of my life. I pretty much knew it pretty much straight away, I think. You just feel it in your heart, and you just feel everything's right. So we got married in 2008, been together, still are together, have two beautiful daughters ever since. And she's always been a great support for me, and still is to this day. I'm her biggest fan, and I know that she never lets me down. There's been some tough times, and she's seen me through them.
I remember back then when you were, just starting to see Sonia and you'd come in here in the studio. One thing that was interesting is that you weren't really that keen to talk about the fact that you met online, because in those days there was still the raised eyebrows about meeting online. These days it's probably the opposite. More people would meet online than anywhere else.
You wear it with a badge of honour these days, but back then, I kind of learned my lesson, because I went out with a lot of dates through those meeting sites, and anyone that knew me knew that I wasn't really big on going out to clubs or pubs. So I'm pretty sure most people worked it out anyway. So I started to be truthful around that time and just said it without hiding it, But now it's like you just said, if you don't meet on Tinder or something, well, then there's something wrong with you. Whereas back then, there was something wrong with you if you were on a website.
Yeah, exactly
But
right. Yeah.
this is a great story. Like I said, 13 years, 14 years marriage, two beautiful children, 8 and 6, the loves of my life as well. So I couldn't be happier. Like, I'm glad I went on RSVP.
You mentioned some tough times there, and when we spoke before doing the podcast about whether we'd mention this, and we both agreed that we probably should because it's had an impact on your life, and that is a battle you had with depression more than 10 years ago now. Can you tell us about that and also about accepting that you were in that battle?
Yeah, sure. So just like it was taboo to go on a dating website and meet your partner through there. Same thing back then in 2010. Um, Depression, seeing a psychiatrist or anything like that, there was still a lot of stigma attached to it. So I didn't even tell a lot of people at work. I told you, I remember I had a couple of weeks off, I think it was, from writing the column. And I was writing for you guys at that time, the match preview, and I just didn't want to do it. Depression is one step further than being sad. It's just awful. It was a really tough period of my life, but I was actually told the one thing to do while I was recovering was to continue to write the column. To not just phase out of the world, but to keep writing. And they were probably, until things improved, I think they were probably about half a dozen or so of the toughest columns I've ever had to write, because depression kind of sucks the life out of you. There's things that make you happy before that don't make you happy anymore. It's really different for everyone. So I went on medication as well. A lot of support from psychiatrists and counsellors, and the medication played its part as well. And you slowly, you dig your way out of it, and you never forget it though. So even 12 years later now, parts of the things you went through back then are still with you, and you never forget it. And I think you always, are afraid of it ever coming back again.
And it must be difficult to accept that happened in the first place in some ways, because on
Yeah.
paper you're only a couple of years married.
Yep.
Kids are on the horizon. You've got a great
Yep.
job that you've been in for a decade, and so a lot of people, I guess, probably can't accept and understand. Well, how could you have depression? And that's one of the big stumbling blocks we have to get over as a society in accepting that just because something looks like it does on paper or from the outside, it's not necessarily what's happening inside.
And I think the other thing is that this is the first time I've publicly actually talked about it. And I have my issues still with anxiety and everything now, but you work your way through it. You find ways to deal with it. You go and you talk to counsellors, things like that. And I always say to people now, and I guess that's why I'm telling you the story and everybody now, that you can act as happy as you like on the outside, but on the inside you can be really, quite depressed and quite awful and quite flat. And I say to everyone, get help. If you can get through it with counselling, which some people can, that's great. If you can't, don't be afraid of the medication. There's so many different ones you can take these days, that there is one for you. Like, not everyone gets it right the first time, but you were around with me at the time. You slowly dig your way out of it, and you just keep going. And support of my family, support of people like yourself, my nephew, my mum, dad, everyone. I just think that a lot of people were supporting me back then, and they didn't even know what they were supporting me for, because I didn't tell a lot of people. Yeah, so I just say, don't be ashamed of it. I really think it's come a long way in the last 12 years. All the rugby league players, that have had it, that have battled it, everything, it's come such a long way. And the reason why I know it has is because I wouldn't be talking to you about it now if it hadn't been, if it hadn't have come this far.
Post that, you do take a bit of a break from writing about footy, and probably for the first time in many years, you're not really involved apart from going to the games and enjoying the games. But in 2019, you do return. Langon League makes its comeback to the Western Weekender, and everything that's old is new again.
Well, yeah, I took 8 years off. After that year, I finished with you in 2010. I think I just sort of channeled my energies into just getting better, and having children was a big goal. That was put back a couple of years, but then of course, you start to feel better and you go there. And I've got two beautiful children during that time, and I always loved rugby league, and that I was I kept going to games and everything. I just lost my love of writing about it. And then one day in 2018, 2019, I just knew with social media and everything else, I just felt like it was time to get back to it. So I gave you a call, I remember, early 2019, and luckily you took me back. We did some stuff on the website for a while, and then the following year in 2020, you brought back Lang On League, and can I tell you, I really got to thank you for having taking a chance on me again. You're out of something for 8 years. Whatever Peter Lang meant 8 years earlier meant nothing now. A lot of people had moved on. A lot of new people had come on board. And I've just found that the last 3 years has been probably some of the happiest years of my life with writing the column. And I really look forward to it and enjoy it. Now with social media, finally, after 4 years, people are starting to take me seriously again. It certainly took a long time. And if I had my time again, I probably wouldn't have taken that 8 years out. But can't go back in time now.
No, that's true. And importantly, as well, I guess you've been able to write the column during a period of success for the Panthers, which is good, because the vast majority of your career has not had that attached to it.
Well, you and I had a lot of twos and fro's. We were like the Paul Kent and Braithen Astor of the world back then, because we were getting thrashed a lot, weren't we, in 2007 and 2008? And now, believe it or not, I was criticised once or twice for being too harsh on them, not by you, but by others. And now I'm getting criticised on social media for being too nice about it. And I think, well, what do you want? Like, we won a premiership, 13 out of 14 games we've won. Best defensive side, best attacking side. There's not too much to complain about at the moment. So, it's great. I write it with a smile on my face every week, and I just hope that this wonderful period that we're going through will continue for a lot longer.
Absolutely. Well, as it stands, you're, of course, still writing Lang On League and still working at council.
I am.
Customer Experience Officer.
Yep.
Now, that says to me, Pete, that if someone's got a problem, they ring Peter Lang. That's basically the story, I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. 4 years ago, I took a little deviation from the job I was doing before, which was in the communications department. Things I need to change then. I need to freshen up a little bit, do something different. So then this opportunity came up, and I must admit I never would have thought that I would enjoy it as much as I have. I absolutely love it. I love helping people out. Everything, like you said, I've spoken to James Tarmo on the phone, Barry Walker is rung up. I've had Anthony Schwerer bring up all these former players who I then, when I hear their name and everything, I go, oh, I've got to tell you, I love you guys. You go, and you would never think that, but it's a great job. I love helping people, and I guess that's what I do, every day when you ring up, when people ring up for anything, whether it be rates, whether it be, the roads, whatever the case may be. I just love doing it.
I'm going to ring you up and talk to you about a couple of issues I've got at
please do.
Bringelly Road at the moment, let me tell you. All right, Pete, a couple of last questions. Number one, you mentioned earlier your education in Penrith, your work has been in Penrith. Has there ever been a time that you wanted to leave Penrith? Because a lot of people would say, you got to get out, got to go somewhere new. I think these days that's less and less, because I think people have seen Penrith grow as a city. But particularly during your time, even as once you got out of uni and whatnot, I imagine that a lot of your friends and whatnot were spreading their wings out of Penrith. Why do you think you've stayed, and do you think you'll ever leave?
No, I actually don't think I'll ever leave. I think I'll probably be buried here. I just love the place. It's part of my, like, they use a lot of this in the rugby league now. It's part of my DNA. I've had my two beautiful daughters were born in Nepean Hospital, one in Nepean, one in Nepean Private. They are Penrith through and through. I'm so glad that my wife Sonia, sort of made the decision all those years ago to stay in Penrith with me, and she was more than supportive of that. Made me buy another house, by the way, and a big enough one that we could have children in, which is just wonderful. Because for the first few years, this house was way too big for us. Now with two little girls, it's amazing how full it feels. It's if anything, you need more space, and I know you've got one little girl yourself.
Yeah.
If you ever add any more, then you'll find the space shrinking more and more. Every room becomes almost like their room, So I can never see myself leaving Penrith ever, and I'm so proud of the fact that I say that. Of course, through the magic of Facebook and people that you used to go to school with, are spread far and wide. Queensland and Victoria and everywhere, and that's great. Everyone finds their own place in the world where they want to stay. This is it for me. I'll never leave it, and I'm very protective of the area and of the people in it, the football team, you name it. It's God's country. Forget Manly. Penrith is God's country.
And last question, Pete, the question we always ask last, and I know it's a difficult one to answer sometimes, but how would Peter Lang like to be remembered in Penrith?
You know what? This will sound really flowery and everything, but just as a nice guy who wanted to always help and sell Penrith. Loved Penrith so much that he became Penrith. Like, it's really hard. I mean, you hear, and I probably can say more personal things like, I want to be the best dad in the world, and I do. I want to be the best husband in the world, and I do, which I'm not, by the way. But I'd love to do all that. I just want to be known as someone that when you hear my name, you just think, yeah, you know what, he's not a bad bloke. That's pretty. I know that's. I don't know if that sounds superficial or not,
No.
or horrible, but yeah. Oh yeah, I know Pete. Yeah, good guy. That's how I want to be remembered, I guess, as a good guy and a Panthers supporter till the end.
Well, Pete, you've had a long history in Penrith, as I mentioned at the top of the podcast in the intro, working at some of the biggest brands in Penrith in terms of Penrith Council, Panthers and the Western Weekender. Plenty still to ride in the story too. Thank you very much for joining us. And
thank you very much, Dodsy. You're a top bloke and a real good friend. And I value that, and always will. We've been friends for about 15 years. Did you know that?
15 years is a long time, Pete.
And a lot longer to go,
Indeed.
I hope.
Thanks very much, Pete.
Mate.
Terrific. There he is, Peter Lang, and I hope you enjoyed our chat. If anything in this podcast raised concerns for you, Lifeline 13 11 14 On the Record is produced by The Western Weekender. To hear future episodes, search Western Weekender wherever you listen to podcasts and make sure you hit subscribe. Check out westernweekender.com.au and we'll see you next time.